Welcome back. Deval Patrick has been in the presidential race for about a month now, and he has a little under 2 months to go to pull off a win that would be improbable but not impossible. The former two-term Massachusetts governor is our guest this morning on Close Up.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I hear from a lot of Democrats who like you, they like the resume, they like the experience you bring to the field, but they're curious how you're going to pull off the win. So what's your strategy? How do you win here in New Hampshire?
Well, it's about people, it's about voters, not about me. I mean, it's so interesting that you meet people who are sort of waiting for someone else to give them permission. They say, you're exactly what I've been waiting for, but you know, first I want to see this or that, or how are you going to do it, the question that you asked. And just as when I ran the first time in Massachusetts, I remind people, you know, this campaign's not about me. It's not about some, you know, burning ambition I've always had. It's about our shared aspirations for a prosperous and just nation for everyone, and not just the folks who are close to power, not just the donors, not just Democrats, but everybody. And if that's what you care about, invest in that. Your time, your energy, your contributions, and most of all, your vote.
You mentioned donors. There's an interesting discussion going on right now being driven by your friend, Senator Elizabeth Warren, about the process right now. She's calling out other candidates for having closed-door fundraisers and kind of schmoozing with wealthy donors. This is kind of how campaigns have been run for a long time. In fact, she ran her own campaigns this way when she ran for Senate.
I know.
Is she making it harder for Democrats to win?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think she has a very important voice, but she's not the only voice, and she has the luxury of having been campaigning for years. So that she has a kind of a machine now that operates, as far as I can tell, from a distance, and good for her. Good for her. Look, we are not trying to raise exclusively from one group or one type of donor. We are trying to raise what we need to be competitive. I'm confident we will be competitive, but I think more than the money is the reason for the money, which is how do you get a message out that is inclusive about making change that actually lasts based on a record of having done just that, as opposed to those who have a lot of great ideas but not actual results. We have results, and so the money has a purpose. It's not a sort of a bragging rights, and frankly, it's about bringing people in, giving people the tools so that they can bring others in. And as I always say to supporters, I'm going to talk to people, talk to your friends and your neighbors, your coworkers, and talk to people who don't already agree with us.
So are you worried that, you know, this not agreeing part, are you worried that her message is alienating, that, you know, essentially she's saying to people who've had success or done well financially, you don't belong? Well,
look, I think I guess what I really want to say, Adam, is more about what I'm about and not be a critic of other candidates. Everybody has a place. And one of the things that people feel really frustrated about in our civic life and in our political life is that not everybody feels like they have a place, or they feel like they get attention paid during the campaign and then all of the attention vanishes in between campaigns. There are folks here in New Hampshire who feel that way. Very intimate process during the primary, and then the day after, everybody's gone. Go to Iowa, it's granular, but the day after, folks feel like they've become, you know, members of a flyover state, residents of a flyover state afterwards, and that is a problem. So how do we make, what I'm trying to do is convince people, not just as a matter of rhetoric, but as a matter of record, personal commitment, the way I live my life, that the folks who feel unseen and unheard will be seen and will be heard, not just through the campaign, but once our administration is in place.
This presidential contest has dabbled in some fairly substantive conversation about the issue of reparations for American slavery. What's your position on reparations, particularly direct financial payments, and trying to right some of these intergenerational wrongs that clearly exist without exacerbating existing racial tensions?
Well, it's a really great question. It's a really ticklish issue, I think, because for me, reparations don't mean a thing without reconciliation. There is a conversation, there's an understanding about our history, there's an acknowledgement of, and when I say our history, I mean American history, not just African American history, and not just white American history, but our history, the contributions that folks have made to building a remarkable and unique country. And the fact that our values, freedom made possible by equality, opportunity, and fair play, have been in tension with our reality from the beginning, and the fact that we grope toward this more perfect union is exactly why we've been a magnet for the world for as long as we have. So I think we've always had trouble in this country sort of acknowledging how much distance we have come and how much distance we have yet to go at the same time. Do you understand what I mean? There's a kind of a sense that, you know, we finished all that, and so let's move on from some, and others that we haven't done a thing, and all the challenges are ahead of us. Neither of those things are exactly right. You know, we are in this equipoise, and it's true around African Americans. It's true around other people and peoples who feel marginalized. So, yes, I think there are structural things we have to do to make sure that the American dream that I have lived, having grown up in poverty and had the remarkable opportunities that I have had, that is made available to more people in more places. Some of that is about how we grow the economy out, not just up to the well-connected, and I'll have some policy positions on that. But some of that is also about structural impediments that you referred to in housing, in wealth creation, for example, that have exacerbated the conditions of exclusion, and we will have proposals on that as well.
Does the country benefit in 2021 if your Attorney General is prosecuting former President Trump for obstruction of justice in the Russia investigation?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's no precedent for that, doing that to a former president.
No, it's a fair question, but not one that I'm quite ready to opine on, honestly, Adam. I think the whole experience of impeaching a president is a grave undertaking. It's a very, and it should be treated that way. And I commend the members of Congress who are treating it that way. You know, what happens afterwards, and whether the president, if I'm elected, is exposed to criminal charges, I think remains to be seen. We've done a whole lot more presuming outcomes that should be, under our laws, handled through sober process, and I don't want to be that kind of leader.
But that's up to your Attorney General, essentially?
That is.
Okay.
That is, right.
How do you unring the bell on the politicization of the Justice Department? This is something that both sides see right now as an issue. You have Democrats who feel that Attorney General Barr has far overstepped his normal bounds in terms of dealing with the president. And then on the other side, you have people who think that the FBI overstepped its bounds in investigating the president's campaign from 2015 and 16.
Well, you know, I'm an alum, as you may remember, of the Justice Department, having run the Civil Rights Division during the first term of the Clinton administration. So this is very much on my mind and heart. I'm not sure what the answer is other than to just model good behavior, better behavior, high integrity, and that comes from the top. It has to start with me. It has to be the going-in expectation of the members of my cabinet. You know, it turns out, I've thought about this a lot, it turns out a lot of our democracy depends on unwritten rules. You know, rules around integrity and decorum, duty, restraint, right? Respect. These aren't legislated. They're just expectations that make this remarkable experiment called American democracy work. And I don't think there is any way to come back to that than to model that. And that's what people can count on from me as president.
Foreign policy question here, also a little philosophical. I keep coming with these big ideas.
Okay.
Do you believe in a no first use policy on nuclear weapons?
You know, I'd like to. I have in the past. I also know that there are so-called loose nukes out there, and a serious concern. So my instinct is to be there, but I also haven't gathered around me the kinds of intelligence resources that a president, and only a president, would have access to. And so I want to understand that before I commit. But I can tell you that my instinct says that the use of a nuclear weapon at a minimum is the absolute last alternative.
On the issue of climate change, it's pretty much a given that any Democratic president will be rejoining the Paris Accord. But after that, are you looking more in the direction of carbon capture or alternative energy? What's sort of the priority there?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We have, I think, a model strategy in Massachusetts around climate change, and it is a combination of many of these things. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, we joined, I think, in the first day or two in office, and that cap and trade plan is what enabled us to invest in energy efficiency, which is the very first thing we should be doing, meaning you know, a BTU not spent is probably the best, not used is probably the best. Alternative energy, yes, and I think investments in solar and wind, in distributed generation, all of these create jobs, by the way. We found that the clean tech sector was one of a couple of three sectors that helped us climb out of recession faster than most other states. So it's all of that. I think the big question is, do we go cold turkey? Because you hear this from some folks. Do we go to a carbon neutral world? You know, with the flip of a switch. I'm not sure that's practical, but I understand the urgency of it. Because as one person in Iowa said recently, the question is not whether we're late, the question is whether we're too late.
Well, Governor Patrick, we appreciate your time, and we'll see you out there on the trail.
Thank you.